I think behind all these papers really is the bigger question is Ernest an immortal? Are his ideas going to last? It's 25 years on, and as David Shanklin puts rather nicely, a quote I don't remember making, but the 3 Gs have disappeared from Heffer's, Goody, Geertz, and Gellner in 1997. Now, this is the fate of retirement, of course, but the question is, will people still be reading and discussing Ernest in 100 years? Is he on the level of Maitland or Fukuzawa or Sir Henry Maine even? Or which league is he in? If you're in the Premier League in football, you are immortal. If you are, at the top of the second division, and there is often a trade-off which interests me, which is that if you are a really clever and in some ways aggressive thinker, you do very well in your lifetime. Edmund Leach in Anthropology is an example of that, really punchy sort of character. But people may discuss him in a while, but there are others who are quieter and solider, and for some years they may be forgotten. And my supervisor, Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf, is like that, but who are great ethnographers and who will be useful and remembered in 100 years' time. And Ernest may have fallen into the category of people who were, I often think thinkers as either long distance runners or sprinters. And the people I admire are the long distance runners. They are the Montesquieu's, the Adam Smiths, the Maitlands, who thought about a problem year after year after year, and then they produced 2 or 3 really great books after 20 years of cogitation, which changed our world. Ernest was a sprinter. His best work are essays. That's why Sword, Plough and Book has brilliant passages in it, and all his books have brilliant passages. But the longer books are not as satisfying. But the collections of essays are sparkling. And my view is that pursuing the secret of the world, how we got here, is like climbing a mountain. And in order to do that, you need stamina, you need methodology, you need endurance, and you need single-mindedness. You need it to be a hedgehog, if you like. And the great thinkers that I've studied climbed and climbed and climbed, and then they got there. Ernest was someone who tried to climb a mountain without any climbing equipment and just rushed. And he'd sprint up this bit and then stop, and then sprint up that bit and stop. So he never got to the top and looked back and understood it all. But while he was sprinting, you were sprinting along with him, and you saw all sorts of fascinating things. Right. So the question of whether some of his work will outlive him for generations, you might have some thoughts about that.
I think linked with that is also whether the actual question will live on. I mean, it's interesting that you are still engaged with the same sort of question, trying to work out the whole thing. But actually, it's quite rare to hear people talking about this with any sort of authority and without, like, you've dedicated your life to it, and the thinkers that you're admiring have done the same. These days, it's much more soundbitey and it's much more limited in scope, and that seemed to come across in a lot of these essays. They didn't seem to take on the big panorama that you
didn't. Ernest didn't.
No, I think Ernest did. I think you do. I think he's in that tradition, like you say. He's scampering around, maybe, But at least he's asking the same question as Marx was asking, is the same question as Weber was asking, and the same questions you are.
There may be, I think you're probably right, and the reason is, again, explained by Tocqueville. Tocqueville said, I must write my book on the Ancien Regime, and because there is a moment when you are between worlds, you have lived through a revolution. The emotions and questions of that revolution are still alive. Tocqueville was born in the Ancien Regime. His family was a noble family before, and he lived through, and he saw in America and what was happening in France, a world changing into a new world. And he said, if you don't address that question at that point, once a revolution has occurred, he says, the larger the revolution, the less the roots of it are visible. The roots disappear, and even the question about why it happened. I mean, you won't find my granddaughters asking about how mobile phones were invented, you know, or modern technologies. They're there. Once they've happened with technology, there's no question. And once we are here now, who's interested in the first origins of the Industrial Revolution or anything like that, or the Weberian questions? The questions disappear. And I think Ernest attracted me because I mean, I think he had this theory too, but if you look at where the great breakthroughs in thought occur, they occur on, as some people have pointed out, on the fault lines between kinds of civilization, and at a fault line in history between two kinds of civilization. So when you ask the question, why was there no English Enlightenment? The English, having always been modern, they weren't struck by the fact. But the Scots, it was the Scots and the French. And in both cases, the great Enlightenment figures said, you know, this is a new world in England. Why? This is a big question for the Enlightenment on the borders of the modernity. In Japan, the same thing with Fukuzawa, born in traditional Confucian Japan, coming to the West. And he understands and asks the deep questions about what is happening. But once it's happened, it's no longer either a question, nor can you get at its roots, because you can't emotionally feel them. And I think I feel this about myself in relation. I mean, Ernest felt it because he came from Eastern Europe and he was in the war and so on. I was just at the last point. This is why Minerva's owl flies at sunset and so on, because then it's night. The day has happened. You're on the intermediate phase, and it doesn't last long. I had the fortune of coming from a remote part of the British Empire, so I still had a lingering feeling of a world before modernity in some ways, and before post-imperialism, and so on. And so I'm still asking those sorts of questions. The future won't, as you say. It'll just be a historical question, which a few people are interested in because people in the past were interested in it, but it doesn't matter to me.
It's